Morning, citizens. Join me on another relatively rare, beautiful morning, which is something in itself, isn't it? And with me saying that, it kind of reinforces what um, I'm sure you all know, is that I'm not one given to optimism. I know this about myself. I know this is a flaw, a deep flaw in my personality, and one that hasn't always been helpful to me. Um, but having said that, it makes it all the more significant as to how I feel now. You know, we're not about to have a rebirth in the way that the Americans seem to be having. Um, but things are changing. The conversation is moving. The Overton window is moving, and it's moving in ways that I wasn't confident, given my pessimism, that it's not moving in. The conversation is moving in ways that I didn't expect. Um, and it's moving slowly, and many of us, I think, believed, perhaps as an example of wishful thinking, that there will be some event, that um, was a tipping point, turned all of our thinking on its head. Um, you could say Trump's election is that, and for Americans, I'm sure that it does appear to be the case. So good luck to them with that. But for us in sober England, we don't like things to be too sudden. You know, there's a sort of an old joke about um, protest in England and how people go on demonstrations, and all the excitable lefty types and maybe foreigners as well. You know, they lead the chances. What do we want? Whatever it is. When do we want it? Now. Whereas with the British, it's what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? In the fullness of time. Which kind of sums us up a bit. But I am feeling strangely optimistic about things now. Things are moving into the mainstream. Um, People are revisiting the COVID debacle. There's more talk about the vaccine injured and whether they'll get any justice. The grooming gangs have been again in the news. It's fading a bit now, despite the efforts of some, the best efforts. But some of the best efforts are some very high-profile people, like Rupert Lowe of the Reform Party. Um, but one thing I've also noticed is there's been a change in our ranks are swelling, not just from other people who are like us, but from some serious intellectuals who you would never have thought be a million miles from anywhere to do with the things that we thought. People like Mary Harrington, if you're not aware of her, look her up. You know, very intelligent, very thoughtful, and she seems to be getting behind this. Um, the regime, of course, is doubling down, as we seem to say these days. Um, and it's quite entertaining watching them do the things that they do, say the things that they do. I mean, one of the things that Mary Harrington was saying is that she she actually wants them to try and introduce conscription because she wants to see how they're going to try and do it, which is, you know, it would be interesting to see them try and flog that dead horse. Trying at this stage, having destroyed everything, to appeal to some sort of patriotism, having demonized us and jailed us and cancelled us and shamed us. So there was a something that's been doing the round recently, which it was brought to my attention by a friend of mine. Is this podcast hosted by Louise Perry with the Canadian academic David Betts on the coming British Civil War. I was just checking just before I did this. It's at 90,000 views now, which is not enormous, but for a podcast rather than a video, that's significant. And at my last libertarian meetings, it was a topic of the discussion. So it is doing the rounds. And once again, this David Betts, I've never heard of him before, but you know, he's a serious academic, and he's he's making a very intellectual argument which sort of fleshes out Elon Musk's Twitter statement, or X statement, or whatever it is you want to call it, um, where he said that Britain is headed for civil war, and he was roundly condemned for doing so. And those of us who know that he was condemned because they know it's true. Now, civil war is not something to look forward to, obviously, and it's not something to be optimistic about. But it does suggest, again, in the modern parlance, of people waking up and not putting their heads in the sand and hoping it'll all go away. And if you've not listened to it, I recommend that you do. And if I remember, I'll put it down in the description. Um, but he hypothesizes quite a few things that many of us have been thinking, at least since the summer riots or summer protests, perhaps we should more correctly call them. So we've had many false dawns. You know, it's been next month is 5 years since the beginning of COVID. 5 years. That's a big chunk of anyone's life. And if you're anything like me, you probably would have been thinking that nobody will want to talk about the COVID stuff anymore. And it was just going to slip into history, and then nobody was ever going to talk about it as if it never happened. But I think this is gathering steam. The having RFK in charge of health in America is a significant thing. Um, he seems to be pretty determined to do something. Looks like there might be some resolution into this pointless war in the Ukraine. Against the squeals of all the warmongers. So all these things are positive, and it's I, I'd just like to encourage people to sort of, as I have been for some time, to keep pushing at this stuff, and to devote some of your energies to this, just to, even if it's just talking to strangers about stuff. Um, all this stuff that was bubbling under the surface, which the legacy media won't discuss, namely the grooming gangs, is not going away. And the anger that is there is not going away either. I mean, Starmer thought that he'd stamped on it in the summer, you know, and there were many people who thought that that was the right thing for him to do. And when looked at um, in a purely practical sense, you could argue that was the right thing for him to do. You know, he had to stop the riots, and that's assuming that riots are the worst thing that could happen. That race riots are the worst thing that could happen. As I've said before, race riots are not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is what has already happened to all those girls. And some of us may be tempted to think that the reason he jailed all those people was because he loves Muslims, which I don't think he does. And but did he do it because he fears those 5 million Muslims in the country? Which he probably does. But the real reason he did it is because he fears, he's absolutely terrified, as they all are, of 50 million of us. So let that inform your optimism about what's going to happen next. So we are going to win. and we are going to stay free.